The clinking of cutlery in the vast dining hall echoed faintly, a sound too sharp in a place so quiet. Johnson Leo sat at the head of the long mahogany table, a man accustomed to silence, yet tonight it pressed on him more heavily than usual. He was 38, wealthy beyond reason, owner of towers that scraped the skyline of Lagos and a portfolio that stretched from oil to real estate. Yet he chewed slowly, not tasting the perfectly prepared meal before him. His eyes strayed instead to the slim figure of Regina Benson as she moved softly between the shadows, carrying plates, refilling glasses, her presence like a whisper no one else heard. She was not the kind of woman society usually placed before him. Regina's uniform was plain, her shoes scuffed at the edges, her hair tied back in a neat bun. But when she bent slightly to set down a dish, when she murmured a polite, "Yes, sir," he felt a flicker in his chest that startled him. He had not felt such a flicker in years. His body had long refused to respond to the parade of glamorous women who sought his attention, models draped in diamonds, heiresses with laughter like champagne. He had smiled, shaken hands, posed for photographs, but the nights afterward were cold, barren, like steel untouched by flame. And yet here, with a woman who barely met his gaze, something long dormant stirred. Johnson leaned back, pretending to sip his wine, though his focus never left her. He remembered with a pang of irritation how doctors had called it stress, how psychologists had whispered about emotional disconnection. But none of their remedies had worked. He had resigned himself to a life without passion, channeling all feeling into contracts and empires. Until Regina. Until the day he realized that when she hummed softly to herself while polishing the silverware, he lingered in the doorway just to listen. The change unnerved him. He prided himself on discipline, on control sharper than the blades his chefs used. Yet now he found himself inventing reasons to cross paths with her. He asked questions he never cared about before. Is the garden being watered? Have the flowers bloomed by the fountain? Questions meant only to draw her voice into the air. She answered simply, always respectful, unaware of how her presence unsettled the man who had once commanded boardrooms with a single glance. At night, when the city outside his penthouse pulsed with neon lights and the noise of restless traffic, Johnson lay awake replaying small details. The curve of her wrist as she poured tea, the way her brows furrowed slightly when she read from the books she borrowed from the old mansion library. She loved history, he discovered, slipping volumes of poetry and ancient tales into her apron pocket during breaks. It made him smile, secretly, that a maid who scrubbed marble floors could lose herself in the words of Shakespeare or Achebe. He admired it, and that admiration burned slowly into desire. One rainy evening, as thunder rolled across the lagoon, Johnson found himself at the library doorway again. Regina sat by the window, the storm's silver light washing over her face as she read aloud quietly to herself. She jumped when she noticed him. "Sir, I didn't hear you come in," she stammered, rising too quickly, the book nearly slipping from her hands. He raised a hand, his voice unusually gentle. "Don't stop. I was listening." Her cheeks warmed, though she kept her eyes down. "It's nothing important, just poetry." But to him it was everything. The sound of her words wrapped around him in a way no opera, no expensive symphony ever had. He stayed longer than he should, leaning on the doorframe, letting the cadence of her voice etch itself into his memory. After she excused herself, leaving the book behind, Johnson sat where she had been, tracing the worn spine with his fingers. For the first time in years, he felt alive, as if some locked door within him had finally creaked open. He almost laughed, the sound strange in his own throat. His manhood, his spirit, his very soul had been barren soil, until Regina stepped into his life like rain. Yet even in that moment of awakening, he understood the danger. She was his maid, a simple woman earning an honest living. He was the billionaire employer, a man scrutinized daily by the media, envied by rivals, worshipped and feared in equal measure. If the world ever saw what was kindling in his heart, it would not applaud. It would tear both of them apart. Still, that night, as he stood before the mirror, unbuttoning his crisp white shirt, he paused. He saw a flicker in his own reflection, a fire that had not burned in so long he had forgotten its heat. And he whispered, almost in disbelief, "Why her?" The answer, he knew, was not in her beauty, though she was quietly lovely. It was not in her status, for she had none. It was in the way she was untouched by the falseness of his world, in the way she lived simply, laughed softly, and carried dignity in tasks others overlooked. She stirred his desire because she stirred his soul. The morning sun spilled over the wide glass windows of Johnson's estate, painting the marble floors in gold. But within those bright halls, shadows of gossip had already begun to form. The house staff were quick to notice what Johnson tried desperately to hide. The way his eyes lingered when Regina passed, the sudden warmth in his usually cold tone when he spoke her name. It began in whispers exchanged while folding linens, then rolled like a small snowball gathering weight on its descent. Have you seen how Sir looks at her? Regina doesn't even know. Poor girl. Or maybe she does. Maybe she's cleverer than she lets on. Regina herself remained oblivious, or at least she pretended to be. Her focus was on her duties, dusting chandeliers, polishing the endless silver that lined the dining cabinets. But sometimes, when she felt his gaze brush against her skin like a quiet flame, her hands trembled just slightly. She told herself it was nothing. He was her employer, a man far above her reach, a man whose name appeared in magazines beside presidents and tycoons. Yet the thought unsettled her, and at night, lying in the narrow bed of her staff quarters, she found herself remembering the gentleness of his voice when he asked about the flowers, the way he had lingered in the library listening to her read. Johnson, meanwhile, wrestled with himself. He could not allow desire to unravel the fortress of discipline he had built. To test the truth of his feelings, he accepted an invitation to a gala at the Oriental Hotel, one of Lagos' most dazzling venues. The ballroom shimmered with crystal chandeliers and gowns that trailed like rivers of silk. Women approached him with painted smiles, laughter designed to entice, perfume thick as the air of a tropical storm. He responded politely, but inside, he felt nothing. Their beauty was flawless, sculpted and deliberate, but it touched no chord in him. He waited, watching, even willing himself to be stirred, but the night remained hollow. It was only when his mind wandered to Regina, imagining her reaction to the orchestra's music, wondering if she would find humor in the arrogance of the guests, that he felt something stir again. And in that realization came a quiet certainty. It was not that his manhood had abandoned him. It had simply been waiting for the right spark, the right soul. He excused himself early from the gala, ignoring the raised brows of society's elite, and returned home with an emptiness that only Regina's presence could fill. Back at the mansion, the whispers grew bolder. A butler cleared his throat whenever Regina entered a room. Two maids exchanged knowing glances whenever Johnson called for her specifically. Rumors spread beyond the gates, carried by tongues too curious to stay silent. Johnson's closest advisors began to notice his distracted air during board meetings, his sudden softness that seemed so unlike the man they had followed for years. And though no one dared confront him directly, the air of speculation pressed down heavier each day. One afternoon, fate played its mischievous hand. Regina was arranging flowers in the grand hall when Johnson arrived home earlier than expected. Rain clung to his shoulders, his tie loosened, his expression weary. He paused at the sight of her, her hands buried in roses, her hair slightly undone, her face glowing with a natural beauty no storm could dim. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then he stepped closer, the scent of rain and cologne mingling in the space between them. "You shouldn't be working so late," he said softly. She shook her head, her voice calm but betraying a tremor. "It's my duty, sir." The words stung him. It was a barrier, a reminder of the gulf between them. He wanted to tell her not to call him that, to speak his name as if it belonged to her lips alone. Instead, he simply reached out, almost without thinking, brushing a stray petal from her sleeve. Their eyes met. The world outside seemed to hold its breath. She stepped back quickly, cheeks flushing, and bowed her head. "Excuse me, Mr. Leo." She fled the hall, leaving him standing there with his chest aching as though struck by lightning. That night, Johnson could not sleep. He replayed the brief touch over and over, the way her eyes had widened, the way his own restraint had nearly snapped. He knew now that this was no passing infatuation. He had fallen into something deeper, something dangerous. And yet, it was the most alive he had ever felt. The following week, his struggle only intensified. Regina's presence haunted every corner of the mansion. When she laughed faintly with another maid, he found himself jealous of the sound not being shared with him. When she avoided his gaze, he felt both hurt and guilty. His empire stood solid, his fortune vast, yet none of it gave him the peace he once believed it would. His heart was in turmoil, and the staff, watching from the sidelines, whispered even louder. One evening, during dinner, Johnson's board chairman called unexpectedly. "The press has been sniffing around," the man warned, his tone sharp. "There are rumors, ugly ones, that you're distracted by inappropriate company." Johnson's jaw tightened. He glanced across the hall where Regina's silhouette moved lightly, clearing dishes. He knew then that this quiet storm within his mansion was no longer private. The world was beginning to watch. And with that realization, the walls of his carefully constructed life began to crack, one whisper at a time. The scandal did not explode all at once. It simmered, like water on the verge of boiling. Johnson Leo could feel the heat building around him. Snide comments from board members, hushed warnings from his legal advisors, speculative headlines in glossy magazines. "Billionaire distracted by mystery woman," one tabloid screamed, and though no name was printed, he knew it was only a matter of time. The whispers that had begun in the marble halls of his mansion had leaked into the city, carried on the eager tongues of servants, rivals, and society gossipers. For Regina, the shift was devastating. Suddenly, her quiet routine became suffocating. Other maids avoided her eyes, some out of jealousy, others out of fear. She could hear the laughter when they thought she was out of earshot. "So that's her?" The maid who caught the master's eye. Each word cut deeper than the sharpest knife. She wanted to tell them it wasn't true, that she had done nothing but her work, but the looks they gave her were already a verdict. In the stillness of her small quarters, she wept into her pillow, torn between shame and the undeniable truth that her heart raced whenever Johnson was near. Johnson could no longer ignore the reality either. One evening, after another stormy meeting where the board questioned his focus and loyalty to the company, he returned home and found Regina alone in the library. She had a suitcase by her side, her apron folded neatly on top. "You're leaving?" His voice broke more than he intended. She lifted her chin, though tears glistened in her eyes. "I have to. They're saying things, sir. Terrible things. I don't want to ruin you." He stepped forward, his hands trembling for the first time in years. "Regina, look at me. You are not ruining me. You are saving me. Don't you see? I've lived in emptiness for so long, surrounded by luxury but starved of life. And then you." He paused, swallowing the lump in his throat. "You woke me up." Her lips trembled. "But the company, your reputation. I can rebuild a company," he said firmly. "But I cannot rebuild my soul without you." The words hung between them, raw and unpolished, yet truer than any contract he had ever signed. Slowly, he reached for her hand. This time, she did not pull away. Instead, she let his warmth steady her, and in that fragile silence, something unspoken bound them together. The very next week, the scandal broke in full. Paparazzi camped outside the mansion gates. Online blogs published Regina's photograph, labeling her a seductress, a gold digger, a woman who had trapped a billionaire with cunning simplicity. Johnson's empire shook, stock prices dipped, board members panicked, investors whispered about stepping down. But while the world shouted, Johnson made his choice. At a company banquet, standing before a crowd of executives, journalists, and employees, he spoke plainly, his voice carrying with the weight of steel. "You've all heard the rumors. Yes, I love Regina Benson. She is not a distraction. She is the reason I am alive today. And if loving her costs me this company, so be it. Companies can be built again, but a soul, once abandoned, may never return." The room buzzed with shock. Cameras flashed. Some board members stormed out in anger. Others sat frozen, wide-eyed. And Regina, standing at the edge of the hall, felt her knees weaken as tears streamed down her cheeks. She had never expected him to fight for her so openly, so recklessly. The days that followed were chaos. Johnson offered his resignation, prepared to step down as CEO. The media painted him as a man blinded by passion, but among the ordinary workers in his company, whispers shifted from ridicule to admiration. "He chose love," one accountant murmured. "In this world, who does that?" Regina, however, was still torn. She packed her bags once more, convinced that his empire would collapse if she stayed. But Johnson found her at the gates, his expression softer than she had ever seen. "Run if you must," he said gently. "But know this, I will follow. Not because I'm obsessed, not because I'm weak, but because I know what I've found in you. And I won't let fear steal it away." She froze, her heart pounding. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, love could be stronger than the world's cruelty. And so, against all odds, she stayed. The storm did not vanish overnight, but together they weathered it. Weeks later, in a quiet garden ceremony attended only by a handful of loyal friends, Johnson Leo and Regina Benson exchanged vows beneath a canopy of blooming jasmine. There were no cameras, no flashing headlines, just the two of them, hands clasped, hearts steady. When he kissed her, it was not the kiss of a billionaire or a maid, but of two souls who had finally found home. From then on, Johnson understood that his true wealth was not measured in skyscrapers or shares, but in the woman who had awakened his spirit. And Regina, once a simple maid, realized she had never been ordinary at all. She had been extraordinary enough to teach a man of power what it meant to love. And so, their story reminds us that love is never bound by class, wealth, or judgment. It blossoms in the quiet corners, in the places we least expect, and it asks us to be brave enough to choose it when the world demands otherwise. Like Johnson and Regina, we may face whispers, storms, and losses, but when love is real, it steadies us. Remember, communication, kindness, and courage build bridges no scandal can burn. You've got this. If you felt moved by this story, like this video, subscribe for more tales, share with friends, and tell us in the comments what lesson touched you most.